Hi, I'm Eloy Ortiz Oakley, and welcome back to The Rant, the podcast where we pull back the curtain and break down the people, the policies, and the politics of our higher education system. In this episode, I get to sit down with a well-known student borrower advocate and a proponent of the Biden administration's push to cancel student loan debt, Mike Pierce. Mike is the executive director of the Student Borrower Protection Center. Mike, welcome to The Rant.
Thanks for having
It's great
me.
to have you, Mike. You and your organization have been very busy lately. You've been in the consumer protection business for quite some time, and now you're leading a major organization involved in the student loan relief debates. But before we get into all that and before we get into the debate, I'd love for you to tell us more about you, particularly for our listeners who haven't had a chance to get to know you yet. Tell us about your higher education journey and what led you down this path to lead the Student Borrower Protection Center.
I fell into this work by accident. I think that the same way that a lot of folks that do student borrower advocacy, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm a consumer lawyer by training, but I actually got my start when I was a law student as an intern in the Office of Federal Student Aid, the U.S. Department of Education. And shortly after that, I was in my early 20s. I didn't even really know where the bathrooms were, but I was just starting to get a feel for how we pay for college because I had learned all of those lessons the hard way myself. And right after I went back to finish law school, I finished the summer at the Department of Education, the preferred lender list scandal broke. And I don't know, I think this is the audience. If anybody knows what I'm talking about, it's your audience here. But back during the Bush administration, there was the scandal that school financial aid offices were taking kickbacks from companies like Sallie Mae, able to push not just guaranteed federal student loans, but also private student loans on students. I was one of those students. I had a very high rate private student loan that was pushed to me by my school financial aid office. And I saw myself in that story. And I realized that the kind of change we needed to the way that we pay for college was much more fundamental than you could do working within the administration. So I went to Congress instead. And I got a job working for my hometown member of Congress, Congressman Sarbanes, who's still there, just as he was putting the finishing touches on the law that would create public service loan forgiveness. And I worked for a member of the House Education Committee. Then the financial crisis happens, and they're creating this new consumer protection agency that's looking at things just like what happened to people with student debt, but in the mortgage market, people affected by abusive debt collection practices. And I convinced now Senator Warren to give me a job. I was part of the original team at CFPB back in 2011. And I've been doing some version of this ever since. The Trump administration came in. It became really hard to do that work within the administration. And so my former boss and I, Seth Frotman, who's now back at the CFPB, we left and started the Student Borrower Protection Center with this idea that somebody needed to bring that bearing to the fight on behalf of student loan borrowers, to think about this as a consumer financial product, not just as a symptom of the cost of higher education.
Well, that's a great story, and it's particularly great because it's a nice history lesson of CFPB, which has been in the news lately. You know, there are some members of Congress who would like it to go away, but hopefully it sticks around for quite some time. It's definitely needed. Now, there's one part of your story that I want to bring back, which is you were one of those students who had these high rate loans. And so I imagine that's really stuck with you and sort of drives some of your passion today.
It's both stuck with me in the abstract. A lot of our work does focus on private student lending, kind of debt and credit we call shadow student debt, the sorts of financial products that sit inside of the Title IV federal student aid system. It's also stuck with me personally. I still have private student loans that I'm going to be paying until my kids are ready to go to college.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a motivator for sure. We turn our attention now to talk more about student loans and student loans relief, which has been in the news quite a bit lately. You've been a vocal supporter of the Biden administration's push to cancel student loan debt. You and your organization have put out a lot of great work educating the public about the student loan debt crisis. What do you make of the SCOTUS ruling on debt forgiveness? And do you think that this latest Biden plan has any better chance for success?
I'm going to choose my words a little carefully here. I think in part because the decision was both expected and also wrong. This court has decided that historical norms and precedent don't bind it. And it's done things that we would describe as lawless and out of bounds and contrary not just to public opinion, but also to the law itself and often the Constitution. This is one of those decisions that fits right in that box, along with Dobbs and along with a bunch of other decisions that put this new right-wing court majority on the opposite side of the American people and on the opposite side of the law. So I think they got it wrong. That doesn't mean we can expect it to happen. And I would love to talk a little bit more about the politics of that. But I do think what the administration is doing now is different. But in some ways, they're just calling the Roberts Court bluff here. The Roberts decision in Nebraska, it's not a binding precedent in a way that would prevent them from doing exactly what they're doing now. It's narrow. It focuses on emergency powers. It says that the emergency powers the administration used in Debt Relief 1.0 are not permissible under the major questions doctrine. It doesn't weigh in on what the Higher Education Act can do. It doesn't weigh in on all of these other kind of targeted programs to deliver debt relief. It's limited. But the dicta in the decision, the kind of throat clearing, the vibes by Chief Justice Roberts are pretty expansive. They make it clear that this right-wing majority is not thrilled that this administration is trying to use government to help people. And to the president's credit, he doesn't care. His job, he was put in office to help people, to use his power to make people's lives better. And he's prepared to do it. That's exactly what you want to see. And again, the court didn't do anything to stop this. It could have reached further and shut down the whole exercise in delivering student debt relief. But there wasn't a majority to do that. They didn't read beyond the case that was in front of them. And so they've left this administration with the opportunity to give it another try. And I do want to emphasize for your listeners, this is really normal. This is actually exactly how the push and pull between courts and presidents for centuries. There was a period of time in the New Deal era where the court really hated state minimum wage laws, and they were striking state minimum wage laws. And then the next year, the same court upheld state minimum wage laws because the politics changed. Courts are political actors. They're responsive to public pressure. They read the stories about themselves in the New York Times. Famously, Brett Kavanaugh reads his clips. And I think that the blowback to this very unpopular, anti-popular decision will frame the context for the next time the court takes
So
this up.
let's peel back a little bit more of the politics. This is something that certainly Senator Warren, Senator Sanders' offices have been pushing for quite a bit in the Senate. There is this counter argument about the executive branch having to do more than some people believe it should be doing, given that by and large, one could argue that this is Congress's role to set these things in motion, but Congress is enacting. So how do you see the politics continuing to play out? Because I imagine this will come up again, the executive branch taking their own action. Do you think that the politics will influence the court, or do you think that there is a better argument in the way that they're approaching it today?
I do think there's a better legal argument in the way that they're approaching it today. I don't know, maybe better is the wrong word, because I do think that the first version of this was legal in the way that courts had interpreted it historically, and there is something historical about this decision that was just handed down. But I do think going through the negotiated rulemaking process, as the Higher Education Act requires, feels normal. Like the vibes are more normal. I keep using that word because that's what we're talking about, but it does feel more normal. And maybe that's a thing that federal judges, maybe not this court majority, but at least federal judges perceive as within bounds, where the other thing maybe was out of bounds. I'm a little bit skeptical that any of it matters, though, because it does feel like that this is a politicized judiciary in a way that is different than it was even 4 or 5 years ago. And the president is doing here is following the norms of yesterday as an exercise in demonstrating to the public that he is the responsible party here and is governing. And if the court wants to be reactionary and out of bounds, that's the court's decision. And that he is going to use all the tools in his toolbox to be able to deliver for working people with student debt, which is all we can ask of him. And the alternative, the assumption that the Roberts Court got it right and unilateral disarmament in the face of a right-wing court, that's not good governance. It's also really bad politics. I want to talk about, if you don't mind, I would love to talk about both the electoral politics of student debt, but also the legislative politics of student debt, because I do think they're a little. You mentioned the legislative politics of student debt. We haven't reauthorized the Higher Education Act since 2008. it's been a minute since Congress actually
Right.
did its job here. The president's trying to govern in the absence of clear instruction from the Hill. And I think that is what it is. At any given point, there was a point where President Trump had Republican majorities in both chambers, and Virginia Fox, the then chairwoman, now again chairwoman of the House Education Committee, couldn't even bring an HE reauthorization to the floor because there weren't enough Republican votes to move it. There's a real governance problem, and it is not just about Democrats wanting to use executive power instead of legislative power. Neither party has been willing to govern on higher education for, we're closing on 2 decades.
Well, that's certainly true, and that certainly has been my experience over the years. My last conversation with Senator Alexander was, are we going to do this or not do this? And of course, if he couldn't pull it off, I don't know who's going to now. Congress has had every chance to act, and they haven't. So what's left? The executive branch to try and exercise their authority to help rectify the situation that they see happening across the country. Let me take a step back, though. We have this crisis for a reason. You mentioned some of the reasons in your opening remarks about how some financial aid offices in the past have been pushing student loans. And then we've got the continuous rising cost of education. There's many reasons for that. But every time you open the paper, you see some highly rejective college or university raising tuition yet again. I mean, here in California, USC is now, $66,000 a year, which is just insane to me. What have you and your organization uncovered about the challenge with the rising cost of education? How do you feel it's contributed to the current debt crisis?
I'm gonna answer that in
Sure.
sort of a long way, if you don't mind, because I actually think there's 3 different things working here. The first is the cost of college at highly rejected colleges is extraordinary. Particularly private nonprofit colleges are driving a lot of today's student debt. For-profit colleges are also driving a lot of today's student debt. The incentives are a little bit different there. The economics are very different there. Neither of those are where most people go to college. Most people go to college in an open enrollment. I mean, you know this, but most people go to college in an open enrollment school in their community within a few miles of where they grew up. And the fact that we have 43 million people with federal student loans, more than 45 million people with student debt, isn't really just a function of college being too expensive. And it's definitely not a function of brand name, highly rejected colleges being too. What you actually have here, 40% of people that have student debt never completed a degree. You have a problem of crisis among people that have no credential and have debt. And for those people, many of those debts are really modest. These are people with $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 worth of debt the day they walk out the door and don't come back. But the student loan system itself is broken. So the typical student loan borrower is struggling to pay back those loans if they didn't complete their credential. For every 2 people across the universe of 40 million people with student debt, for every 2 people who pay off a loan in 12 years, 3 more are even deeper in debt than when they first started. That's there's something about the economics of higher education there, but there's also something about the structure of the financial product itself. We allow people to fall behind on their student loans and go even deeper in debt than when they first started. And there's something broken about the structure of the financial product there. We use the debt trap to describe this problem for people with student debt. Some of those borrowers are people that were badly serviced by a private company hired by the federal government or hired by their local. There was a huge multi-state consumer protection action by a bunch of state AGs against Navient a few years ago that outlined how some of this works. But people were steered into financial options with their student loans that were not in their best interest, and it resulted in runaway interest charges. And that's what you see across the board. That's the 2 people pay it off, 3 people are deeper in debt. Those are the 3 people. They're people that are in forbearances. They're people that are in income-driven repayment, but making payments that don't keep up with the debt service. Among former students of color, this is much, much worse for Black students in particular. Among Black people with student debt, for every 1 person who pays off a student loan 12 years later, 6 more are even deeper in debt. And the typical Black student loan borrower is caught in this debt trap. So I think part of what our organization has sought to do is tell that story. Yes, college is too expensive. There are extraordinary advocates that have been making that point for decades. college is inaccessible. There are extraordinary advocates that have been making that point for decades. Where we sit in this community, it's talking about the programs itself. The idea that we have an entitlement to debt, but there's not entitlement relief, or at least functionally there hasn't been an entitlement to debt relief, is a huge public policy problem that sits separately from the high cost of
Well,
health.
it's just amazing to think how much debt relief this administration has already created, whether it's through public service loan forgiveness, whether it's through canceling debt from for-profit colleges and universities, or some of the latest moves that they recently announced. Yet it's only the tip of the iceberg. And we're talking billions of dollars that they've been able to forgive. So it's amazing how much we've let this grow. Now, you mentioned your organization and the advocacy that you've been doing. How else do you support student loan borrowers in the work that you do?
So we are not a grassroots organization. Our constituents are people with student debt, but we don't have members. We position ourselves as the lawyers for the movement to cancel student debt. We both are predominantly lawyers. I'm a lawyer, and we're mostly consumer lawyers by training. But we are organizers and advocates that work hand in glove with civil rights groups and labor unions and organizations that represent student loan borrowers to shape the policy environment that these decisions are made in. So we write papers, we build lawsuits, and we also run the nation's first academic center on student debt and the law. It's called the Student Loan Law Initiative. That's based at UC Irvine Law, and we just launched our second center at UC Berkeley Law. And they've been a wonderful home for us. And we work with two extraordinary law professors, one at each school, Dale Jimenez at UCI and Jonathan Glader at UC Berkeley, who were among the earliest academics to sound the alarm about the student debt crisis. And actually, Professor Glader was the New York Times reporter that broke the preferred lender list scandal open back in 2007. And so his reporting when he was a reporter was really formative to my kind of student advocacy journey. And we found ourselves together on this project a decade later, which is kind of wild.
So given all your background and experience, I know I get a lot of questions from borrowers, whether they're current students or graduates or people, as you described, who left their institution, are saddled with this debt. And some of the stories I hear are just heart-wrenching. I have people in my own family who completed their degree, but were sold a bill of goods about the kind of opportunities that they should expect when they signed up that never materialized. And so many of them have, in previous years, gone into default. They're hearing all this news about, are we going to have debt relief? Are we not going to have debt relief? How do I get in line for debt relief? What should I do given that my loans are going to come due for repayment again now that that relief is over? And then they hear plans from the administration about how they're going to support a ramp up. What's your advice to borrowers? I mean, I know it can be a very complicated thing, but if you were just stop in the street and say, hey, Mike, how should I think about approaching my student loans going forward with all the stuff that I'm hearing in the news?
I'll repeat back something that you just said. It is very complicated, and often the financial advice is very specific to your own situation. But there are programs that provide both debt relief and payment relief that are available to nearly everybody. We've launched a website called cancelmystudentdebt.org in partnership with American Federation of Teachers, NEA, SMEET, Teamsters, and a number of other partners to help explain these changes to the programs the Biden administration has made that were not blocked by the Supreme Court, that are allowing people that have low incomes, work in public service, have significant disabilities to be able to get their debts canceled under existing law. The best way to avoid the mess that's coming with the return to repayment is to not have a student loan. So if you're eligible for debt relief under one of these programs, now's the time to take advantage. So the first step is, if you can get your debt canceled, get your debt canceled. And we do have resources for folks on cancelmystudentdebt.org. Studentaid.gov is the federal government's website. There's a whole bunch of information too. You can find out who your student loan company is. You can find out how much money you owe. So I don't want to, lead with income-driven repayment, which is really important. That is the widest payment relief program. But for somebody that has the right to get their debt canceled right now, it's inappropriate to make the pay, even if it's an affordable payment. We need to be getting people out of the student loan system. But if you're stuck, you didn't get $10,000 canceled because the Supreme Court took that away from you. Income-driven repayment is a way to be able to get a lower payment now And the administration just rewrote the rules for this program that creates an entitlement to pay nothing at all and to not be charged interest for folks that have modest income. But that income threshold is now much higher than it used to be. So you have middle-class families, people making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year, which, again, that's not a huge return on your higher education, but it's a lot of people that have kind of working class income and are going to have a right to pay $0 and be charged $0 of interest under this new income-driven payment scheme. So for those folks, you're treading water until you get to a place where you do get your right to be debt-free. But it's better than making payments if you don't have it.
Let me ask you this. In my travels across the country and talking to different leaders and different types of institutions, every now and then I hear different schemes of new loan programs, whether those be directly created by institutions themselves or other types of income-sensitive repayment programs for some of the private student loans that they know that they have to get students to take in order for them to pay for the total cost of their programs. Are you seeing anything that alarms you these days about some of the schemes that are popping up?
Absolutely. And I think that in particular, the idea that the private market can create a better loan product and can offer it to people to the exclusion of federal student loans, we've seen that become a catastrophe for folks. So there's kind of two ways that takes shape. One is as a supplement to federal student aid at Title IV schools, particularly at highly rejective schools. And they're like gap financing using private student loans. There's a separate set of consumer protection problems. But where we've really seen this go wrong are short-term credential programs, often co-opted with brand name schools. There was just a lawsuit filed against Caltech for its boot camp program yesterday. Last week, a bipartisan group of 11 state attorneys general and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau filed a lawsuit against this company called Prehired, based on a case that my team built and referred to federal law enforcement officials. And that was a scheme that pushed people into so-called income share agreements with this promise that if you didn't get a job, you wouldn't pay anything at all. Turns out that promise was a lie. And not only was that promise a lie, but the school, which was also the owner of these income share agreements, then sued hundreds of its students in a Delaware court nowhere near where they live. And state AGs, like really conservative, the South Carolina Attorney General sued this company. This is just fraud. So I do think the leading lights of the movement to have private credit fill the gap here need to be careful who they're getting in bed with, because where we actually see private credit, it is laying right next to fraud. We are really worried about.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of these claims that we're going to create a vehicle that guarantees a job at the other end of this. And that entices a lot of people and it gets people thinking. We'll see how this all turns out, but I'm sure they'll create a lot of work for you somewhere down the line. Let me ask you one more question as we begin to wrap up, and appreciate all the time you're taking to help educate our listeners about what's going on. Many states, including my own here in California, our policymakers are constantly debating how to better, if not control, the cost of education in states, but think about ways to reduce the total cost of education for students, particularly low-income students. Certainly in my state here in California, there's always a debate around the Cal Grant system or other ways to support reducing the amount of debt that students have to take on. Even in the University of California, there's constant debate about how you find ways to better support low-income, middle-income learners so that they leave with no debt. What advice would you have for policymakers? What have you seen out there that you think might work well? What do you find does not work well?
The first is, I think you hit the nail on the head. This is a state policymaker problem, even if folks that federal student loans are Washington's problem. And we have seen states really innovate here on the consumer protection side, thinking about what happens to people once they end up in debt trying to pay for college. How can states use state resources to smooth out the rough edges of the student loan system? They're never going to be able to push, $100 billion worth of student debt relief to their students. That's not within the bounds of what state government can do, but they can stop private sector companies from cheating people out of their rights. You've seen California pass the strongest student borrower bill of rights in the nation, creating a student loan ombudsman to be able to help people with individual problems, and creating clear rules of the road for student loan companies that handle private companies that handle these student loans, both on behalf of the federal government and also for private lenders like Sallie Mae. So you're right. Federalism gives a huge amount of power to the states to set the rules for higher education, but also to set the rules for the marketplace. And where we're thinking about consumer protections, prohibitions on unfair practices, the right to fair dealing, this has always been a state function. And there's nothing special about student loans that makes that somehow out of bounds for state policymakers. So if we're thinking about how to protect people from being cheated by private companies, this is what states do.
I agree. I mean, this is their primary responsibility. And we keep pushing the problem onto the federal government, and then we ask ourselves the question, why do we have this problem? Because states aren't dealing with it, either because they're not dealing with the policy itself, or they're disinvesting from their higher education institutions. As we begin to close, your answer prompted a question in my head. You know, I always get a question, I'm sure you do, there's always questions of why student loan debt can't be erased through bankruptcy. Do you think that there will ever be a conversation that comes to fruition in Congress over this question?
We see green shoots. There's a bipartisan bill authored by Senator Durbin and Republican Senator from Texas, Senator Cornyn. And the Durbin-Cornyn bill does propose for federal student loans to reopen bankruptcy treatment for federal student loan borrowers. It's bipartisan for the first time. Senator Durbin has been in a lonely fight to bring bankruptcy to the fore of this conversation about the student debt crisis for decades. It makes us hopeful that maybe this could get legislated at some point in the future. Things are different now than they were 10 years ago because the federal government owns the loans. You're not talking about restoring bankruptcy rights in a way that hurts the bottom line of a bunch of big, powerful, publicly traded companies anymore. The other thing that I actually think is more interesting and is happening right now is a recognition among bankruptcy judges that there are circumstances where you can discharge debt in bankruptcy. And the Biden administration, the Justice Department and the Education Department have worked together to put together some new rules of the road for how the government opposes bankruptcy petitions. And we're starting to see the first borrowers now get their debts discharged in bankruptcy just based on this new guidance. This is cracking the door. It's not changing the law, but it is progress. And it's educating bankruptcy judges that there are circumstances where we need to recognize that these debts aren't being paid back and that people should have a right to a fresh start, even under existing law. The other thing I would add there is private market is not entitled to the special bankruptcy treatment a huge share of time. We put out a paper last year that found that as much as a third of all outstanding private student loans were made in such a way that they actually can start to bankruptcy. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau picked up on that and has taken a number of actions against private student lenders for either collecting on debts that have already been discharged in bankruptcy or improperly opposing people's discharge in bankruptcy. So on the private side, we're also seeing this change. We don't have to wait for Congress here to do a lot of good. We do need for Congress for a good law.
On that somewhat positive note, I will close this out. Mike, I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us. I know that our listeners will get a lot of great information. These are a lot of questions that are hanging out there right now. And so I do hope that we continue to have you and your organization advocating on behalf of borrower protections. And I hope this administration continues to push forward and support the need to discharge a lot of this debt that really holds back a lot of low-income students, a lot of learners of color, and I think at the end of the day, damages our economy. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining me, everybody. I really appreciate Mike joining me today. If you enjoy listening to The Rant, please hit the like button, follow us on the YouTube channel, hit subscribe, and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for joining us today, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.